when you say the word the yips or the phrase the yips out loud, I think it's a good place to start because it certainly has a very negative connotation to it, almost disease like. You're going to catch something, but the brain is saying don't do this. Last time you did this, it was horrible for us, right? And so I'm not going to allow you to do this. So I'm going to create this fracture in this mind-body connection. So he knows it's 35, 40 seconds before it's his turn again. Same coaches, same Major League All-Stars and Hall of Famers on the field. Now his body's in survival mode. So what does he do? This is about using this as fuel for my development as an athlete to realize that I can use this to become even better than I ever thought.
Let's just say that SportsCenter calls you and lets you know that you've made the top play of the SportsCenter top 10 plays. What play is it that you have been recognized for? Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to United. I am Katy, a third-year doctoral student here at IU, and I'm so excited to be joined today by one of the best in the field and a very close mentor of mine, Dr. Jesse Michel. Thanks for being here, Jesse.
Thanks, Katy. Glad to be here. You're way too kind. I see ourselves as colleagues, but it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for everyone for tuning in.
Awesome. Today, Jesse and I are going to jump into a conversation about the yips, what it actually is, the stigma around it, and what athletes, coaches, and parents, teammates can do when something like this happens. But before we get into all of that, Jesse, I'm not sure how much you follow college football, but here at here at IU, we thought it was only fitting to honor Coach Signetti and the IU football team to kick off the podcast. So I'm just going to show a quick clip.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. I win. Google me.
So Jesse, if we were to Google you, what would we find? What would come up?
Yeah, first of all, shout out. I am a huge college football fan. Shout out to Coach Sig and the entire IU operation. It's incredible what they have done in 2 years and just one of the best sports stories in the last couple decades. I find it hilarious that we're gonna jump from Coach Sig to Jesse, but that's okay. I think if people Googled me, they would just find a picture of me, most likely with a World Series trophy. I think I'm probably best known for in the field. It's probably to this point my work with the Astros, and we had a little bit of success. And there's a picture of me floating out there. The staff was fortunate enough to have some pictures taken with the trophy, and that might be something that shows up on a Google that we take a lot of pride in.
It's crazy that you're trying to downplay taking a photo with a World Series trophy as a sports psych practitioner, but maybe we can gloss over that.
We can. That feels like many, many moons ago, although certainly still near and dear to my heart. The colleagues and teammates and staff members that we worked with when we were at the Astros, some great people, great professionals.
I love that. So speaking of that, maybe tell us about how you got into the field, a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are now.
Sure. Quick and dirty is I've been in the sport and performance psychology field for about 20 years now. I grew up in Los Angeles, playing a bunch of sports, coaching a bunch of sports. I went to college and just really struggled. And I think that's where this idea that there was actual strategies, techniques, theories around how can athletes develop the mindset, the emotional skills and maturity, and really the frameworks to help them thrive in these high stress, high pressure situations. I didn't have it for myself, many, many years ago when I was still trying to compete and consider myself quote unquote an athlete. But that learning experience, knowing that wow, we're putting all this time in the weight room and on the field, and we're not spending enough time on the mental and emotional side of the game, and really the team and development side of the game from a psychological skills perspective. That sort of inspired me to learn as much as I can, and then in my mind, just give back. And quickly felt a purpose, to provide this information to coaches and athletes, which wasn't at that point. This was early 2000s, 2005, 6, 7, 8. Just wasn't a part of the conversation. Fast forward, I have had a lot of experience working with whether it's elite athletes, Olympic athletes, military members. I mentioned my work with the Astros for 5 years. I now work actually full time for a professional services firm. We're bringing performance psychology theory, content, programs, and resources to the business space, executives and leaders and their teams, which is incredibly rewarding and powerful impact. And then still have a small private practice where I work with athletes and coaches. So that's the quick arc sort of my story and how I got into this field. And still am as passionate as I was. I'm now 40. I'm going to be 42 in a couple months. As passionate as I was when I was 22. Just graduating college and trying to figure out how do we carve a path for ourselves in this space.
It's so fascinating and that your career trajectory has allowed you to touch in so many spaces of sports psych because I feel like now as students, everybody's question is, how do we get into the field? And then once you graduate, it's like, well, what sector do I go into? And so it's really cool that you've been able to not only work in the sports psych space, but now start to transition into the performance psych space and business and some of those other areas that we don't always think of whenever we think of sport and performance psychology.
Yeah, I agree. I'm very fortunate in that regard. I think a lot of it is just right place, right time, and trying to take advantage and being the best professional that you can be wherever you are. I talk with a lot of well, students and young professionals often who reach out and say, "Hey, how can I carve a similar path?" Or I'd love to, be the head sports psych at USA Soccer, or I want to work for big business. What should I do? I can still remember my first team session for the Lansing High School lacrosse team in Ithaca, New York. This was 20 years ago. And I can remember feeling the type of sort of nervous excitement that I still feel when I show up. Last week, we held a conversation for 2,500 professional service executives and professionals. And so the conversations remain the same, but the audience changes. But the answer to how do you do all this, and this was 20 years ago, gosh, you just trust the prep and that if you do good work in the right spots, good things will happen. And so for any young practitioners or students out there listening, that's what I would recommend.
Love that. Great piece of advice and something that I'll definitely have to take moving forward into my early career professional years, hopefully after graduation here in a couple of years. So speaking of the work that you've done and sort of the areas that you have, worked with athletes on, worked with performers on, I know that you and I originally got connected over some of the Yips work. And for those that don't know, Jesse and I have been on, I don't know, what, 2 or 3 presentations now with a couple of colleagues, doctors Brandon Harris and Megan Bird, talking about the Yips from a practitioner standpoint, what we can do to help athletes that are experiencing such a thing. So, Jesse, tell me a little bit about how you got into this Yips work, what your background is, and what your experience has been
Yeah.
in this
Yeah.
area.
Absolutely. So I'm so glad we're going to be spending time today talking about the yips. What is it from a scientific perspective? We're going to be talking about the experience from an athlete's perspective. I know we have some coaches sometimes that pop in and listen to this podcast. Hopefully, we can talk about if one of your athletes, experiences this. How can you work with him or her, to help them get through it? And even from a teammate's perspective, how can we show empathy and establish an environment where we can support them through what is undoubtedly the most difficult time in an athlete's career is going through something like this. And I think it's, we talk a lot about demystifying the experience of the yips, and I'm sure we'll get into all of it. We'll talk a little bit about what does the actual research say around what it is, what's happening, why it's happening. But I think first and foremost, I'd be remiss not to highlight that the reason that I got so interested in this aspect of the athlete experience is I went through this as an athlete myself. I was primarily a baseball player. I was a catcher. It's a very cerebral position to begin with. And in that transition from high school to college, I basically, experienced a prolonged bout of going through the yips where I had difficulty just throwing the ball back to the pitcher in very benign conditions, whether it's a bullpen. It even showed up in catch play. It certainly showed up in games, and I would have a lot of difficulty throwing the ball to first base, to third base. And at the time, I had no idea what was going on. I was certainly capable of playing at this level, which at the time was a high Division II level. But because I didn't have the skill set and I had no idea what was happening, there was no path for me to address it. There was no language that I had in order to explain what was happening. There was nothing the coaches, everyone knew what was going on. And it was almost like it was such a tough experience that certainly thinking back at the time, it led to basically a decision to put my athletic experience on pause and shift my collegiate focus elsewhere. And so, I know I'm one of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of athletes to go through this. In fact, I would argue, and my theory is that most athletes, whether it's baseball or you pick your sport, some experience where you've been doing this thing for so long and it's come natural and you've been working on it, and then something happens, there's a catalyst, and you all of a sudden cannot do the thing that should be so simple to do. And it is sort of the beginning point of this trickle down effect that impacts athlete retention and athlete experience. And a lot of athletes just quit. They just walk away because it's so difficult. So that's sort of how I got into this area of athlete development is I went through it, and I didn't want it. I wanted to find out as much as I could so I could help the field and coaches, address it in a more productive way.
Mhm. Yeah, I love how you touch on there are so many athletes that go through it, and we just don't know when we're experiencing it that other people have also experienced it. Like I said, Jesse and I originally got connected over the Yips, and so my experience was very similar to Jesse's. I was a softball player, catcher, same exact thing would happen in high pressure situations, low pressure situations, whatever it is, and sort of like this prolonged experience because at the time there were no words to describe what it was that we were going through, at least to my knowledge. And it was right before, mental health and some of these conversations about mental performance came into the environment of like the collegiate athletic space, especially.
Mhm.
So I think being able to speak outwardly about it, but then as professionals, not only be able to empathize with our athletes, but also, be able to help with certain skills and things like that has become really like empowering for me, but also like thinking about all of the athletes that, still struggle and maybe are still sitting in this area of stigma because they just don't know what it is that they're going through.
Yeah. In fact, when you say the word the yips or the phrase the yips out loud, I think it's a good place to start because it certainly has a very negative connotation to it. Almost disease like you're gonna catch something. And I think that's the first place to start. I don't know. We should look into this, Katie, like the origin of the phrase the yips, where
Mm.
that came from. It would be a fun aspect of this story, I think.
The term yips was coined by highly accomplished Scottish-American golfer Tommy Armour between the late 1920s and early 1930s. Armour used this term to describe the sudden, involuntary movements that negatively impacted his swing, particularly from short range.
The first thing is finding a way to recognize and realize that this is more common than people think, way more common. A lot of folks, if you look at most, I would say if you picked high school competition and above, most fields you look at, there's somebody going through something. It might not be as extreme as the yips, but somebody's going through something where they're second guessing themselves, something that has come simple or natural to them in the past, all of a sudden is becoming really difficult. They're over analyzing some basic movements that they need to execute on the field, and it's impacting their rhythm, it's impacting their trust, it's impacting their confidence, it's impacting their relationship with their coaches, with their teammates. It's sort of the thing that nobody wants to talk about. They're not volunteering for certain drills because they're afraid. And that's this side. They go home and they're thinking about it the next day. What if this shows up? And they carry that stress and anxiety with them from practice to practice. And if you're out there listening and being like, gosh, I went through that, or that's something that I can connect with. It's happening all the time. And so to not only for athletes that are experiencing this aspect of the athlete development, right? And notice I'm using the phrase it's a experience that athletes go through. It could be extreme or it could be, a bit benign, let's say. But just anytime you're on the field and something that you used to do that you used to not think about or come with ease, and now you're spending time really analyzing or second guessing or doubt about what's going to happen, you're going through, a yips like experience. And this is about what perhaps is going on, what are some skills and strategies that I can address it, and how might I have those conversations with my coaches and my teammates. And the yips itself, I'd love for folks to think about the yips sort of on a continuum. The scientific term is actually focal dystonia. And whether we've talked about softball and baseball, but this experience, this response, we call it really, it's a task response. You need to go do something as an athlete or performer, and for some reason, the body is not responding in a way that you can. In our case, it sounds like it was just, throwing the ball back to the pitcher or throwing the ball to another base. This shows up in golf where a putter is standing over a putt and their body is not moving in rhythm, and so it's herky jerky and they're not able to execute the task in the way that they've practiced. There's a lot of players in darts where they're just throwing a dart at the dartboard and their hand sort of freezes up. It happens if you play an instrument. I've heard this in folks that play piano. Their fingers don't move around the keys as smoothly and as easily as they have for years and years and years. I'm trying to think of some other sports. I've worked with some really elite level basketball players where this shows up, where the play is stopped. For example, they're shooting a free throw, and think about when their body needs to start, when they dribble a couple times, then they shoot. There's something in that process that is forcing the body to stop, and it's disrupted almost. And so really this is about times where the body goes from a place of rest to a place of action. That mind-body connection, there is a fracture. And what the analogy that I like to give a lot of times to athletes is when you're going well, when you're locked in, when your body's moving in the way that it can, it's like a Porsche driving 80 miles an hour down a highway. It's just fluid, it's smooth. There's an acceleration piece and then there's a maintenance piece. And as high level athletes, our bodies move in much of the same way. Well, now imagine you put a speed bump on that 80-mile-an-hour highway and you're still going 80 miles an hour. So there's a disruption in the Porsche. There's a disruption in your body. It's a fracture of movement, and it's happening for a lot of reasons. And that mind-body connection is disrupted. And you mentioned high stress, high pressure situations. What we've seen is that this experience really sort of it can start when athletes or performers get to a stage where they are at a quote unquote higher level for either their age group or maybe they're playing up a level, where they perceive that the environment is different. They're doing the same thing, but there's a perception of there's people watching me. I have to make a team. I can't make a mistake, right? So there's already this strong identity with the experience for the athlete or the performer. They define themselves by whatever it is, and they're put in this environment where they feel like they have to be perfect, whether that's true or not. Or maybe they're in a they're 15U and they're playing in an 18U team where they feel like they have to play up. So there's something about the environment that usually is changing, but the athlete isn't changing, and the ask to whatever the task is doesn't necessarily change, but their relationship with that task is changing because of the environment. The other reason that athletes might start to experience this is because they're returning from injury. So literally a movement that has been ingrained in them over their developmental years, their body, their physiological development, biological development from a young age to, again, 15, 16, 17. Now they get hurt. They have to restart that mind-body connection under stress. There is something that has happened that there's sort of a fracture of that neural connection, because a lot of times these movements are automated and the body executes them without thinking. They should be somewhat quote unquote automatic, right? External focus and, sort of trust that your body's doing that, but something has changed. So when in that continuum of the Yips experience, it could be physiological, it could be neurological. There's some really interesting research out there on some brain development and some EEG studies, but it also could be psychological. right? Where it's, performance anxiety, or talk about confidence or self-doubt, or there's an aspect that's really more psychological, and it impacts the way that we carry our emotions, and it impacts the body's tension and all those things. So you never really know. No two experiences are the same, and often no two catalysts are the same.
Yeah, as you're talking, as an athlete, I would be really frustrated, right? Because you have like an explanation of sort of what's going on. So you know that there's some type of disruption, or that, there's something that's getting in the way of being able to perform as fluid as we're used to. But we always want to know the reason why. Like, why is this happening? Like, why did it happen to me at this stage versus like at the previous stages, or whatever it is. And it sounds like, based on what you're saying, that it could be a plethora of things. And a lot of it comes down to the athlete's perception and like what's going on around them in that moment, specifically when they like start to experience it, of the direction that they could take.
Yeah, in fact, I think you actually you bring up an interesting point, because you're saying you're putting yourself in an athlete's shoes, and you're as athletes, we always want to know the answer why. I would actually say that is not necessarily true for all athletes, yet I would
Mm.
say for most athletes that experience the yips, they are prone to over analyzing and overthinking and wanting to know why everything is happening. And it's a good segue into what we know about athletes and performers that might be a bit more predisposed to experiencing this. There's an area of human developmental research. I'm just going to sort of give a high level summary. It's called the Big Five personality traits, and there's a ton of research on this. But they're traits like openness to new experience, levels of, they call it neuroticism, on the scale. Um, you know, there's levels of anxiety. And what we know is that people that are more likely to experience this, they're lower on openness to new experience. They're higher on scales like neuroticism. They're higher on scales like anxiety. They're higher on scales like perfectionism. So even like think about sports where those things are rewarded. I'm thinking of golf. Like oftentimes you have to be perfect in order to hit the ball, yeah, put the ball in the hole, right? There's a small margin for error. Gymnastics, right? You're rewarded for being perfect. Diving, you're rewarded for being perfect. So the environment of the sport itself, if it rewards some of these qualities and characteristics that as an athlete, you almost need to buy into and make part of your identity, then you might be predisposed. Now, there's a lot of different elements that can contribute to predisposition that are outside the sport environment. How you grew up, how your parents or other coaches or teachers, what is valued in the home, in your seminal developmental years, what are the values as an athlete. If you're one of the high performers as a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year old, and you're rewarded for that, and all of a sudden you're connecting your identity with being great and being perfect, the first time you're imperfect in an environment where you might feel sense of shame or embarrassment or guilt, there's a huge emotional component to this that the yips are really driven by. You mentioned our perception and how we think we need to perform in these high performance environments. If we make a mistake and we feel embarrassment, shame, or guilt, those are strong emotions. And those type of emotions in environments where we feel alone or we feel like we need to be perfect, the brain, those experiences are almost seared into our brain. And so a lot of times the catalyst for athletes experiencing yips like phenomenon might be they make a mistake in an environment that should be an easy thing to do. All of a sudden they feel an overwhelming sense of embarrassment or shame. And the brain remembers that, and it holds on, and it doesn't want the athlete to feel that again. So what it will do, it will almost self-sabotage and say, anytime you're in that position again, I'm not going to allow you to do that. And so we talk a lot about fight or flight from a stress response system. Well, this is the brain triggering the freeze response in a very active, dynamic situation. And as an athlete, I'm always going to need to throw the ball back to the pitcher. There's not one example, unless I'm going to the mound, to talk to the pitcher, where I'm not throwing it back. So the task is always going to be there, but the brain is saying, don't do this. Last time you did this, it was horrible for us, right? And so I'm not going to allow you to do this. So I'm going to create this fracture in this mind-body connection. And that will be the brain's way to say, we're not going to allow you to do this anymore. Well, now you still try to do it. And so the way that you move, it's disrupted, and it results in the ball being thrown away or the ball being spiked because the movement is not as fluid and rhythmic as you want it to be because you haven't addressed the experience itself and some of the shame, embarrassment, the perspective, and understand what's really happening.
Mhm. Yeah, and I wanna go back to what you said in the very, very beginning of explaining sort of what the yips is, and one thing that you touched on was, like, we don't wanna catch it. So, there seems
Yeah.
to be some sort of stigma, I don't wanna say some sort of stigma, there is a stigma about the yips, especially in certain sports where maybe, like, coaches don't fully understand what's going on, teammates don't fully understand what's going on, and it becomes a term that's used so nonchalantly or loosely at the same time that the athlete's experiencing something really, really challenging in their career. So, what do you think, speaking to stigma, what
Uh-huh.
do you think makes it so hard for coaches, parents, athletes themselves to accept something like the IPS?
Because it's misunderstood, because you can't see it. Anything that like as humans, we're designed to be a lot more comfortable around things that are certain, around things that make sense. And it's a lot easier to avoid the stuff that doesn't make sense. And anything you can't see, right? Just think about like an actual like virus. You can't see it, but you do your best to avoid it in any way that you can. And so as humans, we are already predisposed to try and avoid the stuff that is outside, of our periphery and what we can connect with. Now, so that's at the core. Now, the other piece of it is a lot of times coaches aren't really sure what to do, right? Do they want to talk about it with the athlete? That they don't wanna make it worse, right? By showing that they care. Like, I think most coaches care in general. Like, that's like, quality number 1 of coaches is you care about your athletes, at least I hope so. So any coach that cares wants to make their athlete feel better and solve problems. Well, if they don't know what to do, then how do they solve the problem? Does the coach know what language to use, how to talk about it? Where and how should they bring it up with the athlete? If the athlete's not ready to talk about it and acknowledge it, gosh, what I don't want to make it worse. The other piece is that, let's hope that it sort of goes away on its own. The athlete can figure it out on its own, right? None of which typically happens. So there's a lot of aspects to this. The other piece is that, as coaches, we want to be able to think we can solve every problem. And if you can't solve a problem, what type of coach are you? Now, I would argue that as coaches, like there are a lot of problems that you don't solve. You're working on something with an athlete in the preseason, and they're still trying to figure that out at the end of the season, regardless of what, like, you're getting a little better as a team. So, rethinking as coaches, sort of what is our purpose? Why are we here? Um, so I think if a coach has had a playbook for what's a best approach to bring this up with an athlete, how should we talk about it? How can we normalize it? What are some drills and strategies that I can do to help this athlete through? Um, because what you don't want to do, you don't want them to feel alienated. You don't want the athlete to feel like you feel sorry for them. Like nobody wants to feel that. And there's not always like the perfect answer for it. And so I acknowledge that this is tough. And a lot of times athletes will just self-sabotage their way out. I don't feel good today. My arm hurts, right? Like, and that's easy for everybody because they're not in practice. And then next thing you know, maybe they don't play the next season. So it's unfortunate, but certainly the first thing is making it a common point of conversation with coaches. So they're not, to your point, just throwing "Oh, dude, this guy's got the yips" around as though it's something that, is the plague and there's no cure for it. Like that's not what this is. This is a experience that many athletes and performers go through, and there are ways that we can talk about it to help them get back and get beyond where they were.
Yeah, and it sounds like not just for coaches, but for parents, for teammates, it's sort of this acknowledgement of what's going on rather than trying to like stay away from it. And not necessarily, maybe this is the case for some athletes, like talking to them about the experience, but really just like allowing or creating an environment where it is normalized that it's an experience and we don't have to like shame or hide away from what's being experienced by the athlete, just like creating a general open environment for them to, I guess, experience it without having to hide.
Yeah, yeah. And I totally agree. And I think coaches, athletes listening to this are probably saying, okay, well, what do we do, right? What can we do? And I would encourage you all to think about this from sort of a multi-layered lens. It's part environmental is how do you set up your environments as a coach? When athletes make mistakes at practice or during games, how do you respond? What is your body language? What is the language that you use with the athlete in the dugout or walking to the next tee or, in between reps? How are you signaling? The best example I can give is an athlete makes a mistake in a situation that costs your team the game. What do you do? How do you reinforce to that athlete? How do you put them in position to have success? How do you make sure that they're not carrying that and holding on to the shame and guilt of that experience any longer than they have to? What are you doing at practice the next day to get them out of that funk and remind them that they're the best person on the team to be? Next time that same situation is called on the field, you want the ball to be hit to them. How are you setting them up for success? And what are you doing as a team in order to create that environment? Then there's the individual piece, right? How is the athlete like explaining that situation to themselves? What skills or belief systems do they have about their ability to bounce back? Are they able to step back and say, you know what? It wasn't the task itself that I couldn't do. It was that the situation, I put more stress on focusing on what happens if I make a mistake versus just doing this thing that I've done 1,000 times. And I can anchor myself into doing that. Okay, well, now I know that. Now I can refocus the next time on what do I need to do to execute this skill? Well, I need to pick out a target and throw it through that target versus occupying my mind with what happens if I don't have success here. Now I've lost focus, right? How do I integrate and relax my body? How do I get my emotions in the right spot? All of those things you're working with the athlete. Then for the parents, right? Or the whoever, the guardians, whoever is there with the athlete at home, talking to them and making sure, hey, I want you to check in, make sure that you're inspiring and you're reinforcing to them that they're still great. They have a place on this team. So it's really a systematic approach. And then depending on how far gone the athlete can be, working your way back up to, just think about as a coach, skill development, right? From a very simple, benign, controlled environment. If you were going to teach an athlete a new skill, what would you do? It would be A to B. You're teaching them, how do you want them to move? What are the cues, physical, mental, that you want them to think about? And then you're introducing a bit more complexity. You're introducing some failure, and then you're slowly upping that skill development to now we're going to do it in practice. Now we're going to throw somebody else in the mix. Now we're going to do it in a practice game. So just thinking about it from a skill development perspective, and it might not be linear, but while you're doing that, you're integrating all these other elements, of the system as well. So depending on how long it takes before you address, the yips for an athlete might be how far back you have to start on skill development and the types of questions and strategies you need to start with in order to get them beyond where they previously were.
Mhm. Yeah, and I like how you mentioned, like, the skill development piece, and I almost wonder how much of that is retraining the brain as well to feel safe in those environments. So we might go back to the point A to point B, relearning how to throw or do something basic according to our sport, and then also training our brains to trust that that environment's safe and that if we mess up, like, it's okay so that we're not repeating those shame cycles as well.
Yeah. It reminds me of so I can vividly recall this was probably my, I don't know, third or fourth year while I was with the Astros leading their mental performance department. And we had a pitcher, and he was really cerebral pitcher, and he was having trouble during PFPs, pitchers fielding practice. That's where all the pitchers are on the mound, and a coach hits the pitcher a ball, and he's got to throw to different bases. You throw to first base, maybe it's first and second, and you got to throw to third base to get the out. Well, why that's important is because in spring training, that should be a very quote unquote easy drill. Pitchers, their literal job is to throw a 5-ounce object 60 feet, 6 inches away to a very small target. Okay. And they need to do it in 4 or 5 different ways. And they need to do it with the best hitters in the world trying to hit the ball 400 feet. So you would think that just throwing to a base where you don't have to be perfect should be pretty easy. Well, this guy, new environment. He's in major league spring training. He got traded in the offseason, something he's done thousands of times. Now you throw big major league coaches on there, you throw coordinators. It's major league spring training. You got Hall of Famers playing in the infield. You got Hall of Famers that are in his pitchers group. Now all of a sudden, the task is the same, but the environment may as well be like he's on Mars. It's just something that he didn't prepare for. So now in the moment, he's already predisposed. Sure enough, throws the ball down the line. Now you're the first rep in spring training. Oh my God, the world is crumbling. And he's got to go back to the end of the line because he knows he's going to have another rep. So he knows it's 35, 40 seconds before it's his turn again. Same coaches, same Major League All-Stars and Hall of Famers on the field. Now his body's in survival mode. So what does he do? He picks up the ball and he runs it all the way to first base so he doesn't have to throw it. Of course, that's what his brain's going to tell him to do. And so he just finds a way to get through that drill. But from then on, it's like, oh my gosh, this thing that I'm supposed to be great at, I failed. I'm embarrassed. There's shame. There's guilt in front of my new teams. How am I going to show up to practice tomorrow? So you can imagine the stress that he was carrying with him for the first few days of spring training. And so what did we do? We figured it out. I'm there. I'm at the field. I realize what's happening. I don't know if other coaches are seeing it, but I go up to him a few days later, talk to me what's going on. So we eventually get to the point where we do extra work on a small field where it's just him and I, and we're practicing, PFPs with nobody there because we had to start at the very beginning. And we're talking through, what is this like? What are you noticing? How is this different? And he threw a few away, but he had to do that in a sterile environment before he was ever going to do it in a team environment like that again. And so it's about going back to the basics, working yourself back, and giving the athlete the understanding about what happened and how, look, when you see PFPs on drill development in a couple days, and you're in a group with Hall of Famers, what's the first thing you're going to tell yourself? I'm ready. I practiced this with Jesse. I got my skills to go to. I know my focal point. I'm going to allow my body to be in rhythm. I don't care if every manager in Major League Baseball is watching me. I know I'm ready. Will he execute? I have no idea. But at least he gave himself a chance to mentally and emotionally be in a place to tell himself when he knows he's going to go do it, I have the skills to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So building on that, for the athletes who have been through it, are going through it, might one day go through it, what would you want them to know, or what would be your main takeaway for them?
Yeah, I would say that as an athlete, you never know when this is going to show up, when you might. And when I say show up, what I mean is something happens where now the next, like, you feel something where you feel shame, embarrassment, guilt, uncertainty, doubt in a way that you haven't felt it before. And now the next time you're doing this thing, all of a sudden you're thinking differently. You're noticing more tension. You're noticing your focus is on not making a mistake versus just not being anywhere, just being where it's been the last 10,000 times you've done this thing. I would say that recognizing, like, oh, this is what being human is all about. Like, the reason I'm thinking this way and feeling this tension is because my brain's telling me, hey man, don't do this thing, or hey gal, don't do this thing again. Like, but no, like I have an ability to refocus and retrain. As athletes, if you got teams that are going through this, I come from a baseball world. If I saw one of my teammates going through this, I would want to grab them and play catch with them, in the next practice, and let them know that I don't care if you throw 10 balls over the fence. I'm going to go run and get each one. And I'm with you until we figure this out. And we're going to talk through it. And we're going to spend time after practice working through it. And I'm here to be the person that you can lean on, because all you need is one person. You don't need the whole team. So just be a friend, empathize, be a teammate. And as a coach, I would say the same thing. Most coaches from I've worked with, the privilege of being around thousands of coaches at this point in my career, thousands of leaders. Most coaches and leaders are the ones that when they were athletes and they were performers, they were the thinkers. They were the tinkerers. They were the ones that were talking about strategy. They were the ones that were putting in extra work beyond practice. That's just a natural path and progression to coaching. So, alert, they are the ones that are most prone to going through this. So I think that when coaches see this, there's actually a bit of a fear around, oh shoot, this is something that I went through that I actually didn't know how to figure out. So I'm gonna stay as far away from it as possible. I know how to coach the physical side of things. I know how to coach strategy, but I don't know what to do here. So go think about it like you're working through this athlete you're working together to go solve this problem and find a solution. The other aspect is you don't need to do this alone. You can reach out to people like Katy, myself, any quality professional out there that does some work in this area, is happy to hop on a phone with you and give you some strategies and some resources to help walk you through it. Now, I will say this is a good opportunity to highlight that there are some folks out there in the universe that would suggest that they're experts, in working in this space. And I think it's up to every coach and athlete and parent to do their own homework and decide, is that the case or not? This is not, if somebody comes up to you and says, I can solve this in 2 conversations. If it were me, I would walk the other way. But that's up to everybody else. I think there's a lot about this is finding this is a big aspect of your identity, and redefining your relationship with the activity, with the sport, with the environment is the first place to start. And thinking back about why are you doing this? Why are you playing? Falling back in love with the sport. Because a lot of times people go through this, typically they will fall out of love with the sport. They lose their passion, they lose their joy, and it can be hard to get back. So just remember that if you're going through this, we know this is tough. Find one thing that you find joy in the sport and start there, even if it's just, lunch after practice with a teammate.
I love that. I also say, I think we've talked about this a handful of times in presentations, is that the experience of the Yips is not linear. So there's not going to be a single cure for every single athlete that experiences it. And it's going to show up again in unexpected ways, or it could. And so this idea that you want to be the athlete that you were prior to experiencing the Yips is not always possible. So getting to a place of acceptance that it is become a part of, like, your experience as an athlete and how you can use that moving
Yeah.
forward in your career. And like you said, maybe there's, like, some passion that's lost, but not allowing the gifts to get in the way of that passion moving
Yeah.
forward.
Absolutely. So a couple things there to respond to. The first is like even the language around we might all not always find a cure. I think that as professionals and as coaches, the language that we use can be really impactful. So I would encourage us to think about this like finding a solution. We're solving a problem. Just like if you're a golfer and you're trying to change the way your body moves to hit more drives in the fairway, right? We would say, hey, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? What's the skill development and neural pathway that I'm trying to develop in order to get my body to move in a different direction? Okay, well, what's the mental and emotional pathways and skills I'm trying to develop to help me have a different relationship in this environment? The last piece is that as an athlete, you have or a coach, we have a tendency to want to say and try to want to emphasize you can get back to where you were. I actually think that's the wrong approach. As professionals and coaches, we should be saying, you are going to learn more about yourself in this path to getting beyond where you ever were, that you're going to be a totally different person and professional. And so framing it like that this is a gift in order to say, gosh, this is going to be the toughest thing I ever do as an athlete. How do I learn about myself and what's happening and how I can address it in ways that helps me evolve as a competitor, as a friend, as a coach, as an athlete, beyond ways that I ever thought possible. And so any athlete that I'm working with that is experiencing this, even that framework itself to stop, because the first thing they want to do is go back to, how do I get back to where I was, where I never even thought about this? And it takes some time, but eventually through conversations and through work, you get to, no, 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 that's not what this is about. This is about using this as fuel for my development as an athlete to realize that I can use this to become even better than I ever thought, because the skills and mentalities and frameworks that I'm going to use to develop a different version of my competitive self will help me get beyond any ceiling that I ever had. And that's how we need to think about that as coaches, that it's not about getting back to where you were. It's a totally different path on, like, it's really a fork in the road. So you're not coming back to this spot. You're taking a fork and you're going beyond wherever you were. And that's how
Mhm,
we need to empower athletes to think about coming through this experience.
mhm. Wow, so many good bits of information in such a short period of time. And I want to circle back to who you are to wrap up today's conversation. So I'm going to hit you with a question, see what your answer is. But let's just say that SportsCenter calls you and lets you know that you've made the top play of the SportsCenter top 10 plays. What play is it that you have been recognized for?
Gosh, Sports Center top 10 plays for a mental
Mhm.
performance professional.
You finally
Um,
get your spotlight moment, even though we like to be behind the
yeah, I
scenes.
don't I'm already uncomfortable thinking about spotlight moment. I'll tell you what, and I hope most folks in our positions, as mental performance professionals would respond in this way. My top 10 moment, unquestionably, is being behind the scenes and helping an athlete over the course of many months or years work towards achieving a goal that, whether it's an Olympic medal or a World Series championship or a coach that's winning a Super Bowl, just to know that you can be part of that story. And then and then they reach the pinnacle of their career, and you just have that fleeting eye contact moment walking off the pitch or walking off the field, where you know that they appreciate and value the time that was spent, because that's why we're here. And so the top 10 moment would be, for me, just that split second of eye contact and acknowledgement that, shit, like, this wasn't easy, and it's not supposed to be easy, but that coach or athlete needed a village, and we were a small part of that village.
Mm. That's such a great answer and somehow made your way out of it. It's like
That's
you're
right.
not actually in the top 10 or the top play of the top 10, but the
That's
athlete
right.
that you're working with is. All right, I can respect that answer.
Good,
Well,
good.
Jesse, thank you so much for joining the United podcast today. I think you left the audience with so many good bits about the yips, and hopefully we've destigmatized and normalized the conversation around it, for athletes, for parents, for coaches, and teammates that may go through this in the future, and hopefully validate some experiences of athletes who have already been through it. I value you so much as a colleague and as a mentor. I'm just so grateful that you were able to join us today.
Yep. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks so much. If you want, feel free to reach out. I'm on LinkedIn, certainly X. You can reach out, but always look forward to the next coach or parent or athlete that wants to continue the conversation. So, Katie, thanks so much. Big fan of this podcast and the reason why we're talking today. So, hopefully, everyone out there recognizes that we all have a responsibility to highlight mental health awareness, to make these conversations part of our development, and to reduce the stigma and provide the resources and support that we know not all athletes, but humans need in order to thrive in these situations. So thanks so much, Katie, and look forward to the next time we connect.
Thanks, Jesse.
Third overtime, 44-41, and a touchdown wins it. Snap back to Hilinski, drops back, has time, passes left, caught, made at the catchment to the 20-yard line, more onto the 10, runs for the win, dives for the